and the other thing is I would say to number two, what drove me to reapply for this grant in Austria so quickly is like, I felt cheated. Stupid COVID. The project wasn't exactly the same, but there were some key elements of it that were the same. They had to be the same because that was part of the research that needed to be done. It was a project that was part of. There were installations in Styria that you had to go see and walk around and look at to study them, and so that remained the core. What did evolve was sort of the framing of the project, because the person that I was working with at the University of Graz actually retired at the end of the fall in 2022, and he knew that was coming. And what was really interesting then about the project that I ended up working on was that he was developing a digital archive for the project that I was actually looking at in real time and real space. And so what I will also be able to do is take a look at how the actual installations and exhibits sort of translate into this sort of digital archive where it will live later, and what does that mean for how the installations will be perceived in the future. So it evolved in facets, but not necessarily in its core, the project. Because even though the work is not time delimited, I think the relevance was time delimited. And so the appeal of the first round project was that it was designed to sort of integrate my questions into an ongoing project. And then the project finished because it was a 10-year project and it ended in 2022. So had I been there in 2020, I would have been part of some of those events toward the end of the project, but while it was still open and technically ongoing. 2022 then was the end of the project, and so it would not really have made so much sense to work on a project that's my research project with my questions that were targeted toward a project that was ongoing, maybe moving toward completion, and thinking about what the immediate reception or aftermath of this project would be. To go further out, like 3 or 4 years, wouldn't really have made much sense. I actually have to say that the Glück im Unglück was the Klimaticket, because that wasn't available before. And I remember thinking, I need to go to these. So this project has 8 locations in the Steiermark, in Styria. And in order to get a good view of the project, right, any good researcher has to go to all of them. And these are all walking paths. So each site has probably, 5 to 7 installations on a walking path. So it's basically, it's basically an excursion every time you go to one. And I remember thinking, well, how do I get there, and how am I going to manage this? And the Klimaticket is just like, I don't care. I just find my way. I can go anytime. I can go as many times as I want, which I did. I'm probably, one of the only people that's seen some of these things, except for the designers, as many times as I have. But that was actually just really helpful because it wasn't a one-off, right? So I could go back and see, who's walking on the trail, if anybody, what's it like in different kinds of weather, and sort of just get a more complete view of the communities and these spaces. And it's a project that also involved some other monuments on sites along the Danube, and I could it sounds really silly, but the ability to travel freely wherever, and go to places multiple times, that was amazing. One of the things that I realized, I think we all realized, is the value of the visual and the need for the visual that was even more imperative when that's all we had. I had a clearer understanding of the power of the visual in ways that I perhaps did not necessarily before the pandemic, because I can tend in a classroom to be very focused on the spoken and the oral in the moment. And so I think I made my slides. I think I prepared those aspects of my teaching differently after the pandemic, and it helped my students because the visuals could support and facilitate our communication with one another, navigating the linguistic differences that would inevitably arise in whatever forum I was teaching. The one thing that I realized that my students, and I think they appreciated it, they were always very surprised when I talked about it, but at the beginning of each of my classes, I talked about my understanding of a classroom as a learning community, of which we are all a part. So all of the students are a part of this learning community, and I am part of this learning community also, which means that, it's not me and them, it's us together. That is a feature of US academia that I haven't noticed so often, particularly at bachelor's levels, or actually any level, in the German or Austrian academia that I've been a part of. One of the aspects of Austrian academia that I would try to take back would be the assumption that my students are going to do the work that I assign them. They don't always in Austria, but the assumption is that if I give you a book to read, you're going to read it. You don't always, I can give you some discussion questions, but I don't have to ask you how you're doing. I don't necessarily have to give you all the discussion questions. I can have certain higher expectations of what you will do. I'm teaching a class this fall for my students in German on older German literature. I'm thinking about ways that we might be able to create some kinds of installations on our campus, not unlike the ones that we found that I was studying in Styria. I don't know what we'll do, but I'm thinking about some sort of at least campus public facing project that would actually have my students working on these older texts to make them relevant for an audience that has no idea what's in them or what they're for or why. So pedagogically, I'm working through a potential project with something related to what I was doing in Austria. I like Austria. I like Austria because it's not Germany, and I think when you learn German as in school in the United States, you learn a lot about Germany, you learn a bit about Austria, and you learn even less about Switzerland, and maybe you'll get to Liechtenstein, but probably not. You'll probably run out of time, right? And so I think one of the great pleasures of spending time in Austria, and then that's actually what I had wanted to do. I've spent time in Germany. I wanted to spend time in Austria, and learn even more about why Austria is not Germany. And I say that tongue in cheek, but it was just a wonderful opportunity to be able to spend time there, because it's geographically beautiful. It's gastronomically delicious, and the German's a puzzle because the dialects are so close to the surface where the standard is kind of a thin veneer. And you can wander away from the center of a city. You can even go to a suburb, but you go out into the countryside, and then all of a sudden you're just like, what was that? What was that? I mean, it gives me great pleasure to know that the Austrians also experience it this way, but it was kind of, for me, it was a language puzzle too, right? It's like, I want to go understand these people because it's not the standard that I learned. So I had some really interesting close the loop experiences. So I ended up playing in an orchestra in Graz, which I had started in, and some people remembered me when I turned up at a rehearsal, but I had only been able to go to one rehearsal before the pandemic sent me home and close everything down. So I was able to play and complete a concert cycle with them. I actually did meet the person that I had met once briefly, the woman, Frau Felber, from the building that I lived in, where we had this chance interaction one day after the pandemic had closed everything down. And I actually had coffee with her about a month ago, and we just finally had a chance to chat and just sort of close that loop. And one of the students from my class that I met once and then continued online from 2020 ended up in the class. She took the class that I offered this time around too. The insight that I had, it just sort of deepened my my appreciation for being able to have these kinds of conversations, have the opportunity to go back and have these close the loop. So the project closed the loop, and some of these other conversations were, able to sort of close a loop. But to have those opportunities and opportunities for deeper conversations and interactions, I was able to go back and just sort of settle, do the project, meet the people, see the people, have the discussions, be in the place. What a gift.